Got any codes here? Welcome back to part 2 of this. If you missed the last episode, what we finished doing was creating our Pydantic models, our MPC in, our role-playing tips, and our MPC out, as well as almost completed our routers. We can get to the API endpoint and get a response back from OpenAI about an MPC level 1 character that we want created. So in this episode, we are needing to create our database with Postgres and also our query slash repo that actually saves the data to the database. So in our migrations file, I have 0001 underscore MPC underscore characters dot py. This is the SQL code that's going to create the database once we run our migrations. So you can see we created a table that's MPC level 1 that correlates to this MPC out model that inherits from our base character, which has a name and a race, additionally an ID, a personality, physical description, and a list of role-playing tips. And the role-playing tips have IDs and a tip. So we create this table in our database, which is D&D-campaign. We get an ID, which is serial primary key, not null. So it has to have an ID, and every time a new NPC gets saved, that serial key goes up by 1. We give it a name with a max length of 124, so the name of the character can't be 125 or more characters. It's not null, and it must be unique, so you can't have 2 NPCs with the same name. Which we might change that in the future if we decide to have 2 characters with the same name. We have a race, which is a text field, which doesn't have any restrictions on how long it can be, and it must also not be null. A personality column with a text, which can be null. A physical description, again, text, null. And then we also have to create the role-playing tips. Because the way the information comes back, it comes back as a list of objects, so we need to save each of these. So we give it an ID and a tip, and a column called tip, which will save the tips. And it references, this creates a one-to-many or foreign key relationship to our MPC level 1. It references MPC level 1 ID, so it's referencing this serial field right here. And on delete, it's going to delete all the role-playing tips. So if we delete our NPC, it's going to delete the role-playing tips associated with that NPC. So that's in our up command. So when we run our migrations, it's going to be python-m migrations up. So it's going to create these 2 tables. And if we were to do migrations down or delete the migrations, roll them back, we would just delete the tables here. So in our router that we had completed last time, we're going to have to add the repo in here and pass this NPC data to it, because right now we're just printing the NPC. So in the queries folder, our NPC underscore creation query, what we're going to have to do is we're going to have to import the pool, which creates the database connection between Postgres and the FastAPI backend. Then we need to import our models, create NPC out and our role-playing tips models so that we can use them in our repo. So we're going to create a class called NPC creation repo, and this is going to hold all the methods for FastAPI to talk with the Postgres database. So this method is create. We're going to pass itself and the data, which in this case is going to be the NPC. Then we got to make our connection and get our cursor, which does all the writing to the database. Then we're going to use a try statement just to make sure there's no errors. And then we're going to do insert MPC level 1, and we're going to pass it the database connection and the data. So in this method, insert MPC level 1, we're calling this method right here, and we're going to use our database and execute some SQL code to save this MPC to our database. So you can see we're going to insert into our database table, which is MPC level 1, which is this table that we created right here. And we want to update the name, race, personality, and physical description fields. And we want to give it the values. This %s is a wildcard or a variable, so to speak, that we want to pass into it. And we want to return the ID, and we'll need that to get our role-playing tips. You can see in both the migration and in here, you can see the SQL code is enclosed by 3 quotation marks, and that's how you got to write it for it to work. So after this SQL code, what we get here is a dependency list. So this is going to be a list of the variables that we want to pass into the database that we want it to save. So they do have to be in order. So you can see that we want to save, update the name, race, personality, and physical description. So in our dependency list, we want to pass the name, race, personality, and physical description that we get from our data from the OpenAI API query that we did earlier. These %s's take these in order. So it's going to insert in PC level 1 the name. It's going to come find this value. It's going to be like, oh, it's a variable. So let's go to our dependency list and grab the first piece. So they have to be in order, and that's how that works. And then we have to query the database using this .fetch1 method. And it's going to return the MPC that we just created in a tuple. So we're going to take the first variable in that tuple, which is going to be the serial ID that was created. It's going to return this ID right here. So we're going to return that, and we're saving that as NPC ID. So then we can do our role-playing tips, and we can insert our role-playing tips in another method using the database, the data, and the NPC ID that we just created. And you'll see why we need that here in a sec. So if we go down to this insert role-playing tips function method right here, we're passing database data and NPC ID. We're going to initialize an empty list, and then for the tip that we get in our role-playing data, our role-playing tips data that the OpenAI API gave back to us, we're going to iterate through that, and we're going to save them to the database. So here you can see another SQL block. We're going to insert into our role-playing tips database. We're going to add a tip and the character ID that the role-playing tip goes to. Again, we have 2 variables or wildcards or whatever. So we need in our dependency list to pass the tip and the NPC ID. And we get the NPC ID that we passed in, and then the tip from iterating over this list. So this is going to execute that command. We're going to get our role-playing tip ID. We're going to fetch one. We're going to get the ID, which is 0. And then we're going to create a model with the role-playing tips with the ID of the role-playing tip and the content of the tip, the role-playing tip. And we're appending that to this empty list. So each tip is going to get added to this list. And we're going to return these role-playing tips. And the reason we need that is because in our model, our MPC out, what we want returned back as JSON, we want a list of role-playing tips. So we're getting it into the list. So now that we have our MPC saved and our role-playing tips saved, now we can create our NPC out model. and we need to pass it the ID, the data that we got, and also the role-playing tips. And that is going to do this method down here, which is create our NPC out character. So we get the ID, the character ID, which we passed from up here, which is this. And we get our personality out of the data, we get our physical description out of the data, the name and race also out of the data, and our role-playing tips. And this returns it in our create NPC out model. So it's going to return it like this. So that's how you do a post request to create the NPC and return the data back in JSON friendly format. Now, you'll see that if we run it right now, we're just going to print it. It's not actually saving it to the database because we actually never call this function. So let's see that in action. So we're going to work at GNOME Depot again, and we want to make this guy a little chaotic evil. Why not? I'm going to let that run. We're not going to get a response, but we can go back to here and see the response it gives us with all my errors. Okay, so here we get Bertle Copperpot, a gnome. And here's the personality, here's the physical description, here's the role-playing tips, which is a list of tips. So it's printing that out like we expect. And we're also getting an internal server error that we expect because we're not actually returning anything in here. So what we need to do next is in our router, we actually need to call this repo. So we're going to call the repo, we called it NPC creation repo. So let's, from routers.npc creation, import the NPC creation repo, and we'll call this repo NPC creation repo. And we need to do equals depends. And that's also for some testing stuff. So this will recognize it as the repo. So now what we can do is going to be called, let's call this npc out equals repo.create, and we can pass it npc data. And because this query is returning our npc out model, is returning a model, we should just be able to return npc out here, save it, go to Docker. One thing we didn't do yet was we did not migrate. So let's do Python -m migrations up. So we can go to make sure that worked. We can go into our Postgres database. And see we have our NPC level 1 table with the serial IDs and our role-playing tips tables now. So we have that, so now it should actually be able to communicate with the database and save it and return information back. So let's run this. Well, also, just to show that it hasn't saved anything. So from NPC level, nope, select all from NPC level 1. It should be it's an empty database. So let's just execute this again. And if I didn't forget anything, it should return our MPC out model and be saved to our database. A little circular import of importing the router into the router. So let's go back and give it a shot. So now again, remember that this is sending the work and any additional information we want to the OpenAI API. It's going to return a dictionary or JSON response of name, race, personality, physical description, and role-playing tips. And you can see we got our first character back, and this is the exact model, our NPC out model. It has our name, race, ID, personality, physical description, and role-playing tips in there. So what we did in this video was actually get all of that and save it to our database. So if we go to Docker and we go back to our database and log back in, so if you remember, we didn't have anything in our NPC level 1 table before. So now we have Mr. Grimble, our gnome that works at Gnome Depot, Grimble. So it is now in our database, and we can save it for future use. Send it to the front end, and let the front end do all of the work that it needs to do, and display this and let the user do whatever they need to do with their NPC. So let's just do a little quick wrap up. In this episode, we expanded. We got our we took our model and our router. We created our migrations, our database tables in Postgres. We created the NPC level 1 table, and we created the role-playing tips table. Then we had to migrate them. So you go to your Docker container. If you're doing a virtual environment on your computer, you run Python-and migrations up, and it creates these 2 tables in the database, so that can actually store data in our database and retrieve it later in the future. Then we had to create our actual code that lets FastAPI talk to the database and database talk to the API to FastAPI. We do that with our connection to the database, which is this pool. Then we created a class called NPC creation repos, and we created a method on there called create, so that when we call this NPC creation repo dot create, it's going to run through this code. It's going to make the connection with the database. It's going to insert the data into the NPC level 1 database. It's going to insert the role-playing tips into the role-playing tips database. It's going to return all of that, and it's going to pass it to the create NPC out model, which is this model. And it's going to return it back to the router. So the way we called that, we added the repo into our method, our function, create NPC characters. We use this repo. We call it, we set NPC out equal to the repo.create. So we're calling that repo, we're calling that create method in there and passing all the NPC data. And then we return the NPC out. So this is going to be the JSON data that our API returns back to the front end. Thank you for following along. In the next video, we're going to go over creating the other HTTP request and RESTful API. Get a list of all of the NPCs we've created. Get a specific NPC, and we're going to be able to delete an NPC and also update any data. So if the OpenAI gives us something, it's like 70, 80, 90% of the way there, and we just want to add a couple more things or edit a little bit, as the Dungeon Master, we can edit this information. So again, thanks for following along, and see you in the next video.